Thanks so much for coming. It's Stanford, we like to say we're at the forefront and the cutting edge, and I really believe this organization, we're going to get to set the agenda for how people think about learning online, and it's just a real exciting opportunity. So a little bit of background about how I work, what I do. I got a PhD in cognitive psychology, so my specialty is running experiments to see how the human brain responds. But I've become a technologist where I build immersive virtual reality, and for the last 18 years I've been building immersive VR and testing applications mostly about teaching, learning, other domains as well, and using this technology to really study how the brain responds. So as we go through the work today, keep in mind that what I do build the technology, but my specialty is in studying how people use it. So the overview of the next 40 minutes, no one's going to walk out of here without knowing exactly how the technology works. We're going to spend about 10 minutes really giving you some technical details about what virtual reality is and how it works. I'm then going to give you, in my opinion, the 5 home runs that we have for learning in virtual reality, the 5 ways I truly believe that this technology will transform the way that we think about learning curriculum. And we're going to close with talking about scalability. People like Jay are bringing VR to the world in a number of ways, and for 20 years I've been giving a version of this talk, and I used to have to just kind of skirt over this fact that you have to have a very expensive lab at Stanford for anybody to experience these learning simulations. But we're at the point now where the technology is going to be in living rooms across the world very, very soon. And just to be devil's advocate, the world of virtual reality is full of people who've embarrassed themselves saying this. So since 1983, people have been saying, next year, VR is going to be in your living room. And I've always resisted. I've always resisted saying that. But I'm going to make the case today that it is going to be in your living room soon. OK, a show of hands. How many guys have worn a helmet? Very good. How many guys have worn a helmet and actually been able to walk? OK, a couple of you. So I want to give you some definitions to help you think through this technology. So all virtual reality is a cycle of 3 processes. Tracking your physical movements, redrawing a scene based on those movements, we call it rendering, and then displaying new sensory information to the eyes, the ears, the skin with touch, sometimes to the nose, and I don't know anybody doing taste. But let's ground this discussion in something that you all know. Everybody knows Pac-Man, the video game Pac-Man? How do we do tracking of your physical motions in Pac-Man? A joystick. A joystick, you move your wrist, and this joystick has sensors that can tell that you moved your wrist. And how do we do rendering in Pac-Man? Well, that computer receives the information your wrist has moved, and it draws that biter 1 pixel over. And then there's display. We send new images to a computer screen, and speakers give you some sounds. And Pac-Man is a cycle of tracking your movement, drawing that guy 1 pixel over, and sending that information back. VR works the same way, except the tracking is natural. So in my lab, you wear LEDs all over your body. They emit infrared light. There's cameras that can sense the position of these LEDs within 1/10 of 1 millimeter accuracy, about 200 frames a second. So the way that you walk around in VR in my lab is you literally just walk. And the way that you look at something is you turn your head. And if you want to touch somebody, you reach out your hand and you touch that person. And so the tracking is done naturally. In terms of display, we send information to a head-mounted display that gives you stereoscopic view with a wide field of view. We've got spatialized sound, so an array of speakers can move sound around the room. So when I turn my head because I see a bird fly by, the actual sound will come from that bird. And we do some virtual touch as well. For example, we have a floor that can shake your feet. All of this tracking and rendering produces an experience like this. So what do you think this gentleman is doing? What's that? He's in heaven? I would say he's in the opposite of heaven. He is walking the plank, okay? So what he's seeing, he's got a helmet on, and he sees a 3D model of the room. It looks just like the room to the extent that most people think they're seeing see-through video. But they're not seeing see-through video. They're seeing a 3D model of the room that we're redrawing 150 times per second based on his movement. So if he walks a meter forward, we draw the room a meter back. If he turns his head this way, we draw what's over there. So what he's doing is he gets comfortable walking around through the room, and then I hit a button, and we drop a 10-meter chasm right in front of him. So he looks down, and now there's a cliff that goes down 10 meters, and it's a chasm that goes about 5 meters across, and we put a very rickety plank over there. Okay? And so what he's got to do is balance and walk across that plank. For the last almost 20 years, I've been running at least 1,000 people per year through simulations like this. And there's a reaction that I used to get a couple times a year that I'm now getting, probably 3 to 5 times per week. And this reaction epitomizes what we call presence. Presence is the illusion of non-mediation. Forgetting you're in VR, letting your back brain overrun your front brain, and completely being convinced by the simulation. So 1 in 3 adults now, when I hit that button and drop the chasm, 1 in 3 adults just says, take me out of here. They get extremely upset and they don't want to be there. Kids tend to do it not so much, but adults really affected by this. When I ask you to walk over that plank and actually step off, only about 1 in 5 adults will do this. It's really hard to override that, and we call this presence. Now, what's the reaction that I was talking about that we have a couple times a week now? Imagine that you had fallen off the plank. We model gravity, so you fall down this chasm. If you wanted to save your life, what would you do? You would dive at a 45-degree angle and try to catch that lip. So when you come to my lab and do a tour, if this was you, I do this, okay? And I follow you this whole thing. It's called spotting. And I don't do this lightly. It's not as if I'm being rude and I'm trying to touch you. It's because a couple times a week I have somebody that dives. Okay, and if I'm not there to catch them, they hurt themselves. And so, people always ask me for what's the home run applications involving VR. And Jay, you can tell your students that whoever invents the airbags for VR is going to be really rich. So VR creates what's called presence, which is forgetting you're using technology at all. Very compelling. But I'm a social scientist, so I don't just build virtual scenes, I build avatars, which are representations of people. So if I take this device, which is called the Microsoft Kinect, it's basically a 3D scanner, and I wave it around your face, in about a minute and a half, I built a 3D model of your head and face. So this is my colleague Jack Loomis, and this is his avatar here. Okay, it's a 3D model, which is basically, it's a cluster of pixels, each of which has an XYZ position and a color value. But I want you to take a step back for a second and think about what it means to be digital. So let's take digital songs as this disruptive technology. When songs became digitized and Napster became huge, completely transformed the music industry. Think about a digital thing. Once I've got one, I can make 1 billion copies for free. I can send it all over the world with the press of a button. It never degrades, lasts forever. But most importantly, it's symbolic information that can be accessed and transformed. So now with Jack, I can send him all over the world to every single living person or anyone who has a Facebook account once everyone has Oculus in their living room. But in the history of computer graphics, there are millions of what we call animation files. Animation file is a fancy word for a body movement. So now I can have Jack, not only can I send him out, I can have him perform any physical action that's ever been imagined by an animator. So Jack can have others see him or can have himself see himself doing something that he's never physically done. And we'll return to this concept later on in the talk. It's a really big idea. I teach the class on media history at Stanford, and seeing yourself as if in a mirror, and your mirror image takes on a life of its own and behaves autonomously, is a really powerful phenomenon. It's not enough to just make an avatar look like you, it's also got to behave like you. So here's a computer vision algorithm that we use that from a webcam, we can track your facial movements. We're tracking 22 points on your face. This is the real-time video, and this is me animating that 3D model I've created to reflect your actual face movements in real time. So in other words, when my model for research is I run experiments, and we run hundreds of subjects per week in my lab. You come into the lab, and I model your face. Then you go to the station where we track your gestures, and in 5 minutes, we've now captured this digital version of you, looks just like you, and now it behaves like you and emotes like you. And it took me 5 minutes to capture this. One of the hardest aspects of virtual reality has always been tracking your movements. And when we think about VR, we often think about the goggles. But it's not just about the goggles. So this device right here is called the Microsoft Kinect. I recently had a gentleman from Microsoft Research assure me that this is in 75 million homes in the United States. What this does is it tracks your body movement. So you've probably seen this device, but let me show you how the underlying algorithm works. So I've got no fancy lights on my body. And what it's doing, it's bathing me in infrared light. That light bounces off. and we're able to, in real time, glean the XYZ position of 24 points on my body, 30 frames a second. So what's plagued VR scientists for decades, which is being able to track somebody's movements, this is solved. This is solved. Now, the other aspect of display, we literally 3 weeks ago had this experience of Shawnee, who gave you demos earlier today, climbed up this ladder to this plank here, took down this $40,000 head-mounted display, which has now become a $40,000 paperweight, and replaced it with a $350 Oculus Rift DK2. It's a fraction of the price, but it's a better helmet. It looks amazing. I don't work for Oculus. I'm just stunned by how good this product is. So we've replaced our super fancy one with this $300 version. There's now about 100,000 of them that exist in the United States in the hands of developers. And so what we've had the monopoly, basically, of scientists and labs of having this experience to deliver stereoscopic vision, and now everyone can have them in the home. So it's a really magic tipping point for this technology, which is why I'm glad you guys are here listening to me today, try to pitch to you how to use this for education, which is one of the more pro-social applications. Corporations are really starting to care. So we've had fairly high-profile visitors from all 4 of these companies very recently to the lab. And who's going to be the first one to put head-mounted displays in every living room in the country? I'm not sure. A lot of folks from each of these organizations believe they're going to be there first. What I can assure you is that these organizations are putting major resources into doing so. So when I give this talk on education, the question that's popping in your mind is, but there's no helmets in classrooms. And I assure you there will be helmets in classrooms sooner than maybe even we all want. They're going to happen soon. Okay. Excuse my bad math. This is 5 ways to transfer that VR is going to transform learning. I added a 6th and then decided to clip it due to to allow more time for Q&A. So we're going to talk about all 5 of these independently. So the one that you've all probably been thinking about since I've been discussing using VR for education is the one that has been viewed most in literature, in science fiction, and the one that's probably fairly obvious, which is, at Stanford and other universities, we're here in the Department of Education. We talk about experiential learning, learning by doing, and this is the prevailing theory in education. And in VR, what you can do is you can put somebody inside the learning material. You can leverage what we call embodied cognition, which is using your body to operate within a space and to really take your hands and to get into the learning material and learning by doing. VR allows you to create lessons that may not be well suited for a textbook. And I'll give you an example of this, of one of these that we've built. So we worked with a marine scientist named Fio Michelli to build a virtual version of a coral reef that she works on off the island of Ischia off the coast of Italy. So this is a very special reef that shows the future of the ocean because there are these volcanic jets, and it's very rare that a volcanic jet spews out pure carbon dioxide. These do. And what you can do is you can look at this rocky reef that she works on, and you can look at the future of the ocean as a function of the distance on the reef from these jets. In other words, these jets are bathing this reef with carbon dioxide, and simply by looking at how close the carbon dioxide is to the reef, you can say, well, this is what's going to happen in 50 years if humans continue to produce carbon dioxide at the rate that they are. So what we've developed is a scientifically valid. Fio was very active in helping us make sure that we weren't being activists. We were really sticking to the science of ocean acidification. Actually, how many of you guys have heard of ocean acidification? Okay. How many of you think it's acid rain? Okay. Typically, and I'm not saying this to be cute, most smart adults have no idea what ocean acidification is. And so half of you raised your hands saying you knew what it was. That's higher than normal. So we decided to build something to really show it. And what we've created is a simulation where you go in and you get to swim through this reef, and you go on, basically, you hear a scientific lesson that instructs you to do a bit of a scavenger hunt, and you're going around and learning about what's happening in the ocean, and we fast forward time. And you watch your ocean, your reef, you watch what happens in 50 years, 100 years if humans continue to produce carbon dioxide. And it's a very scientifically valid, but powerful and engaging lesson that leverages people really actively navigating the space. So we just finished running an experiment where we compared this to video, and I can talk a little bit about that if you'd like to in the Q&A. But what's more exciting to me right now, because we've been showing for a long time that immersive learning is more effective than watching from video. What's exciting for me now is that about a month ago, I wrote an op-ed for the San Francisco Chronicle about this study. And I was able to link to the online version of the story an exe file that was literally the learning content. Okay, so anyone who has a Rift, which is 100,000 people, could right-click that, save as, and instantly be getting one of the world's expert on ocean acidification, Fio Michelli, take them to this reef, swim them around, and show the relationships among all of the sea life, what's happening as a function of carbon dioxide production. So we've always talked about in this community that it's time to let's build immersive learning, and many of us have shown that it works better than traditional models. For the first time ever, we can actually put our money where our mouth is and build and share these simulations. The other thing to think about this is labs are expensive. And if I can create the most amazing version of a lab in any domain, so I'm not convinced that VR should replace instruction, right? There's a lot of things that we learn very well from taking notes and lecturing. It's what I'm doing to you guys right now. But augmenting this lecturing style with a lab, only the richest students in the richest countries get to experience great labs. Once I build one of these, I can make $1 billion for free, and everyone on the planet can get access to not just a video of a professor, but the most expensive lab, and it's as if you flew to Ischia and went scuba diving. In fact, Brian Perrone, graduate student in education, is taking this simulation into schools starting in January. We're going to actually put kids inside of this and bring VR to the classroom. Okay, second area is what I like to call teacher superpowers. So if all of us were in VR right now, we'd all have the 3D models of the room and each other stored locally on our machine. Some device like the Kinect would be capturing our movements, and the way that we would be seeing one another moving is our computers would all be sending one another our movement data, and we'd be drawing one another locally on our machines doing that data. In other words, Skype works by sending pixels over a network. What VR does is your movement gets categorized locally by this. Our computers tell one another, Jeremy walked forward, Jeremy smiled, and then everybody draws a version of me on their computer smiling or doing what my computer said I was doing. So is that clear? Face-to-face, whatever I do, you see. With Skype, we send pixels over the network, so whatever you do, or whatever I do, you see. With VR, all of us are constantly redrawing the scene based on the tracking information that we get from one another. Is that difference clear? Yeah? So that allows us to have a very strange phenomenon occur, which is in VR, you can see what I'm doing, or you can see some strategically transformed version of myself that's designed to make me a better teacher. Okay, and that sounds very abstract right now, but I'm going to ground that with a lot of examples. The first study that we ever did in this arena was in 2003. We wanted to ask the question, what happens if a teacher can increase her ability to look at people? So from a nonverbal standpoint, other than me walking up to you and poking you, which is not appropriate in a teaching context, looking you in the eye is the most powerful nonverbal tool that I have. However, in this room, there's a problem. There's 120 of you in this room, so each of you gets my direct eye gaze less than 1% of the time. What if all of you could be receiving extra eye gaze and perceiving that you're getting this eye gaze differentially? In other words, in VR, not only can I put a filter on the output of my Kinect that sends strategically transformed data about my behavior, but all of you can simultaneously receive differently transformed versions of me simultaneously. And we started really simple from an algorithmic standpoint on this. We had a teacher and 2 students, and for the control condition, the students always saw where the teacher was looking. So if the teacher looked over here, everyone in the room saw the teacher looking there. In the experimental condition, simultaneously, each of the students saw the teacher staring at them in the eye the entire time that the teacher was talking. So imagine during this lecture, I stared at you for this whole 40 minutes. Okay? So what we did with about 11 lines of Python code was we simply redirected the head position of the teacher so that everyone in the classroom received the direct gaze of the teacher for the entire time. So what did we discover in this study? The first thing we discovered is that people hate this, okay? It's really uncomfortable to get stared at for a long time. Humans rarely look at each other for more than 3 or 4 seconds, maybe a little more if you're intimate. So people really didn't enjoy this as an experience. But the second thing we discovered is that nobody thought it was fake gaze. So it wasn't as if afterward, when we asked them to describe the study or describe the teacher, that they thought they were seeing an algorithmically filtered version of the teacher. They all thought the teacher was just staring at them. The third thing that we get was attention. So as a teacher, getting attention is half the battle. So at Stanford, I actually had to ban laptops in my classes because I couldn't compete with social media. So I need to get people's attention to be a good teacher. If you're a salesperson, if you are a politician, attention is the precursor to getting influence. The cool thing about VR is you can get quantitative measures of attention. So this thing is capturing my body position and my head movement and where I'm looking 30 times a second. So we could build a quantitative measure of where these students are looking and how engaged they are. When I use my super gaze algorithm, remember there's just 11 lines of code in Python, you guys look back at me more. So simply by transforming my avatar, I can get more attention than I could in a face-to-face context. And the fourth thing that we get is learning. So as a class, if I had a super gaze algorithm going on right now, all of you would learn more. Your test score as a class would go up. And we've replicated this study a number of times. Next line of studies about nonverbal superpowers involve mimicry. So a woman named Tanya Chartrand demonstrated experimentally in the mid-90s what perhaps artists and others have known for quite some time, which is if I mimic you, you like me more. So what Tanya did is she had people go into interviews, and the person being interviewed would either mimic the nonverbal behavior of the interviewer or not. So if the interviewer, if she crosses his legs, then I would cross my legs. And if she leans forward, then I would lean forward. So what Tanya demonstrated, which has been replicated 100 times, 200 times in the last 20 years, people don't notice this consciously. So nobody consciously understands they're being mimicked, but if I mimic your nonverbal movements, you like me more, you think I'm a smarter person, you think we connect better. So this idea of creating this rapport works quite well when people mimic face-to-face. But in this room right now, let's pretend that I wanted to employ a mimicking strategy. There's two problems. The first is I'd have to choose the VIP in the room, and I could mimic her, but I can't mimic all of you simultaneously, right? Just simply not possible. The second is I'm working very hard right now to choose my words carefully. And if I'm trying to mimic non-verbally while doing this, this detracts from the verbal message. So let me show you an early study where this woman is a teacher, and she's trying to teach him about various topics. And what we've done is we've secretly replaced her head movements with a slow mirror of his. So whatever he does, he's the student, she does 4 seconds later. So he looks up, 1, 2, 3, 4. She looks up. So a very simple algorithm. This was probably 15 lines of Python code, which receives the packet of the student's behavior, and it has the teacher return that packet. She puts her name on it and sends it back. So it's a slow mirror of the student. When we ran the study, we expected about half the people were going to detect this. Remember, I'm basically stealing your head movements and putting them right on my head. Only 1 in 20 people consciously realized they were being mimicked. So we asked them after the study to write a detailed paragraph about the head movements of the teacher. Only 1 in 25% of our subjects realized they were being mimicked. And those tend to be people that had extreme movements. For example, if they spun in their chair, we hadn't locked in the neck bone, so they got to see The Exorcist. So people that really moved a lot noticed it, but for the most part, one-on-one, you don't move that much. And it's real subtle micro movements where I'm moving my head, the teacher copies them, and you don't consciously realize it. So in this study, people don't consciously realize it, but they look back more. So again, in trying to get your attention, simply by mimicking you, you look more at me. And they learn. They learn better, they are more attentive, they actually think you're a smarter, more credible person. So again, the big idea here is in an online learning scenario, the teacher's avatar, small changes that you can make automatically and basically for free have large changes in the outcome of the learning. The other thing we can tweak is co-learners. And this is going to sound like a strange study, but we did a study about the spiral of conformity. So imagine that there was 20 devils in a room. Devils meaning these are students that were looking around and throwing paper airplanes and talking out of turn during a class. Now imagine that we overrode for each devil, we showed them rendered version of their co-learners as angels. So everybody is actually being 20 devils, but each devil sees his or her colleagues as angels. And what you get is a slow spiral of conformity where people conform, the kids conform to the rendered version of their co-learners as opposed to the actual ones. And so the way we instantiated this was simply by looking at the teacher, and you can cause children to pay more attention to the teacher simply by dialing up the amount of attention from drawn co-learners. So kind of a big idea of leveraging the others in a room. We're doing research on stereotype threats, so we've run experiments where we say stereotype threat, for those that don't know, is Claude Steele's theory, which is that if there's a stereotype, for example, that women are bad at math, and a woman walks into a class and is reminded of that stereotype because the teacher is male and all the other students in the room are male and it's a very male-looking room, there's been hundreds of studies showing that this causes people to perform worse. So what we've been doing is running studies, for example, where we match the gender and the race of the teacher to the gender or the race of the student. In addition to overriding my behaviors, you can literally have my face change and showing students, teachers that match their demographic better. We're doing the same thing with co-learners. So there's no necessary appearance. There's no necessary truth to your race, your gender, your age inside of virtual reality, and we've been using these social cues to try to get students more engaged. All right, let's leave nonverbal superpowers, and I want to go to assessment. So I actually gave a guest lecture in a class today, and I horrified the students with this idea, but I think it's a good one nonetheless, which is imagine that right now, as I'm pacing around this room, I was recording all of my movements with this Kinect. So 24 points on the body, the XYZ position of each point, 30 frames a second. This file is already so big you can't even open an Excel. You can't even open an Excel. Just a ton of data about your body. So when we think of big data, we tend to think of large demographics, but there's a lot of data about how I've been moving. We've been running for the last decade studies where we collect data about people's movements, and then using machine learning algorithms, we come up with models that can predict outcomes based on their movements. And we just published a paper about a month ago that captured students' body movements while they were learning a verbal message, created machine learning models that associated their body movements while receiving instruction with their test scores. And what we demonstrated is that if you give the model a student that's never seen before, almost with 90% accuracy, it can predict your test score based on how your body moved while you were hearing the lesson. Okay? And this is not, we've done this in a number of different domains. For us, at least, this is not a controversial thing. So there's a lot of ways we're using this. So one way we're using it is that if you've got online learning instruction and you know the student is exhibiting a body movement which indicates confusion or they're not understanding, you can dynamically change the content based on that. You can think of all sorts of things. You can slow the lesson down. You can force them to take a break and come back. All sorts of different things you can do there. But here's the really weird idea. And I do believe, I personally stand by this idea in my own mind. I don't have data for it. When you take a class at Stanford, when you take some classes at Stanford, there's very few data points on which you're graded. You've got a midterm, a final, attendance in section, maybe a project or two. Maybe it's 7 data points for a typical class. Maybe it's 15 for a more elaborate one. But one bad day can ruin that. If I can create models that can predict an outcome, which is how well you're going to use this information, how well the knowledge is going to transfer, how much you've actually learned, the question I pose to you guys, if you're going to have your future tied to this assessment, which is we do right now with test scores, what would you rather have? Hundreds, let's say 50 hours worth of data of the Kinect tracking my body movements while I'm learning, or these 7 data points? And I believe that if you're trying to predict true learning, a detailed profile of one's body movements during learning is going to be more predictive of how one uses knowledge from instruction than the 7 data points where we learn quite easily how to game exams, especially with grade inflation. So the question I pose to my students is, will you let this be your grade? And they don't like that, but we might. So the fifth one and final area for learning I want to close on is something called incidental learning. And this is a little more outside the box for this talk, but there's no doubt that we learn things from media. That's not always about the content. And one of the examples in terms of media effects, which is how media affect people, that probably gets the most press is something called video game violence. So this is not my research, but there's decades of psychology research. If you play violent video games all day long, the probability of you being more aggressive in the physical world goes up. It's fairly uncontroversial among psychologists. So the idea is you're not being taught to be violent, but it just emerges from all of this media use. And immersive virtual reality, as we talked about with the pit, it feels like you're there. It feels very real. So what can we learn that may not be about the curriculum, but we can instantiate some lessons in there? And to give you some context for this, I'm spending a lot of time now working with Sesame Street, and we're trying to figure out how to embed good lessons into virtual scenarios, right? So when one of those four companies I mentioned or other companies puts these helmets all over the world, the 5-year-old is going to put that helmet on. Okay? And so I'm working with Sesame Street to think about how to make the content for kids, because that's their demographic, how to try to embed lessons in it that are good lessons. So let me give you an example of how one would do that with incidental learning about being a hero. So this is a project I did with Shawnee Bowman. This is actually her honors thesis, the woman who gave you the VR demos earlier, and a woman named Robin Rosenberg, who's arguably the world's expert on the psychology of being a hero. And what we wanted to do was take that paradigm of video game violence, that a media experience has profound effects and can change your behavior later on, but do the opposite, which is teach someone to do something good. And so I'll let the video show you what happened in the study.
Been an earthquake warning and the city has been evacuated. A child has been unaccounted for and the parents have informed authorities that their child is diabetic and will go into shock without insulin. You have a vial of insulin in your pocket. Your task is to fly through the city to find the child and deliver the insulin, saving the child's life. As soon as you see the child, call out. You must indicate to the experimenter that you found the child, so please clearly announce that you see the child when the child comes into view. You may now begin your search. Lift your arms above your head to take off from the ground.
It's very arousing. People sweat. When astronauts come here, they say this is the closest they've ever been to space on Earth. The floor is rumbling. They're feeling the wind. Those are trackers, so the way he's controlling his locomotion, this speeds him up, this slows him down, and he points to wherever he goes like Superman.
Thankfully, you've reached the child before diabetic shock set in. You hand the syringe to the child who injects the insulin. You have now completed your task and saved the child's life.
So in this experiment, we worked with Robin because Robin believed in her therapy, she uses thinking like a hero as one of the ways that people become better. And she really believed that if you give someone a gift, you give them a superpower, and then they use that for good, that this is really going to affect people. And so that's why we settled on this. The control condition for this study was instead of flying like a hero, like a superhero, you're riding in a helicopter and you save the child's life from a helicopter. So this is what we measured later on. And this is a paradigm that we've taken from social psychology, which is you have an actress fake an accident, and you videotape the subjects and see how helpful they are. So again, the idea is how the virtual experience changes you in the physical world.
Okay. Did you have any trouble with dizziness or anything? Okay.
When you fly like a hero, every single subject who flew like a hero helped. Many of the ones from the control condition did not. Large effects of how helpful they were, how quickly they helped, how thoroughly they helped. So the idea here is a message that's embedded subtly inside of a virtual scenario transfers to the physical world. And Todd, we're down to, I should be wrapping up. Is that, okay. So how does it scale? Corporations are backing it. There's already 70 million connects in homes. I wanted to show you this. This is Google Cardboard. So right now, I can take a piece of cardboard, fold it up, take my smartphone, which has an accelerometer in it that can track your head movements, slide it in, and I've got a pretty compelling VR experience. So this is called Google Cardboard. There's competing products to it as well. And yeah, I think we should close and do some Q&A.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I'm from the System Lab. And I was wondering, I guess you haven't done this yet, but the long-term effects, I mean, the teacher gaze and the people following your body movements, you got some good results from short-term effects. What about the long-term effects?
So there's been 3 longitudinal studies that I know of done in immersive VR. Longitudinal means looking at it over time. We've done 2 of them. And we actually we did this really strange study where we had triads, 3 people come in, and they came in twice a week for 10 weeks and spent an hour doing things like this. And we looked at the really weird situation with mimicry where both people were mimicking you at different time lags. We also built the team face. So we morphed the 3 faces together. So everyone was wearing the team face, the hybrid face of the all 3. So it's this extension of team. And the data, of course, is complicated. We did see changes over time, but not anything in the area of it just wore off. So I do think how you use it the 5th time is very different than the first time, but it's not, so far in our limited longitudinal studies, the effects remain. In terms of a lot of our behavioral studies, for example, the HERO study, I would say in about 25% of our experiments, and we've run hundreds over the last 20 years, we'll look a week later, sometimes as far as a month, and the effects tend to be there still. But your question is great. We need to do a ton more of the longitudinal studies, and it'll be easier once there's helmets in every room.
I mean, the teacher gazing at you, after a while, you start ignoring them.
Oh, yeah, but we've got to remember, I'm a bad programmer. So we just had the teacher staring at you for 100% of the time. You can imagine much more elaborate algorithms, right? Which is if you're speaking, then I'm going to look at someone else when someone else talks. Maybe it's only for 10% of the time compared to what it should be 7% of the time. But think about, when I think about this, I like to look at the arms race that goes on between spammers and spam detectors. Right? The algorithms get more creative, the people get more wise, and it's just this back and forth that's going to go on. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, Steve Goodman. I'm in the School of Medicine.
Hi.
So you talked about using this for good.
Yes.
But the same power can be used to create unrealities that can convince people that ocean acidification is not occurring.
Yeah.
And all sorts of things that are remarkably compelling, more compelling than various media outlets that serve up disinformation.
Yes.
And I'd be very interested in hearing the thoughts about the power to make people think that what is true is not true. The other question is more conventional, which is, what are the kinds of things that this is good at teaching versus the things that maybe it isn't?
Great. Let me actually, for me, the harder one to answer is the second one. The first one is a real easy answer for me, which is VR is a medium. It's just like TV. It's just like the video. And it's the metaphor I like to make is that VR is like uranium. It can heat homes and it can destroy nations. And I'm trying to heat homes, okay? But when we think of the downsides of VR, so you pointed out nefarious political messages perhaps as one, but I think about things that are less political perhaps, which is addiction, right? So if Facebook now feels like a block party, when pornography feels like sex, when gambling feels like being in Vegas, how does this affect the institutions that we care about? And Stanford kids, as you see on campus, they can't really walk without doing this, right? Their legs don't work, and when it becomes more compelling, how is that going to affect? So we think about addiction and multitasking. On your second one, which is what is immersive learning good for? I'm going to actually give some opinions here because we don't have so much data on this. There's only been a handful of studies that have really looked at this. And there's a guy at Harvard, his name is Chris Dede, that does a lot of good work on it. In general, things where body movements are important, right? So there's a lot of things that work really well from a blackboard, and that system has evolved over a long time. And we don't want to break that. There are some, so obviously learning physical motions is one that's going to work in VR, but a lot of the research we've been doing is augmenting what we call a telling lesson, which is either a MOOC or a typical lecture, with a lab that really puts them in the space and helps motivate them to learn. So there are some things that you uniquely learn because you can change your viewpoint or feel some touch. But there's a method of this. Imagine that you were learning about the ocean and you got to go scuba diving. Like, how cool would that be to motivate a kid to actually want to learn? She actually gets to go scuba diving. What we can do is provide those kind of boosts when you need it. But a lot of ways to think about I've got a lot of theories about when it's going to work better, but we're just starting to scratch the surface on this. Thanks. Yes.
Robin Dunbar in the Center for Teaching and Learning.
Hi.
So on that upsetting student experience today, when you suggested that somebody could just watch their body movements and tell how much they were learning, is that largely in a student sitting and being lectured to setting, or has it been tested across different kinds of learning environments?
So we've done probably about 5 studies in the last 10 years, and some of them have been learning physical tasks and predicting when you're going to make a mistake. The study we just published was a one-on-one where they were standing and one student was teaching the other student. So we actually haven't done the lecture one because that would require lots of connects and they'd interfere with one another. So we've actually done the more tutoring type of scenarios. Yeah, thanks. Yes. Oh.
Hi, my name is Kia. I work with the Carnegie Foundation.
Hi.
So I had 2 small questions. One, how much thought has been given to the institutional and societal changes that may inevitably follow? So, having to go to class when you can go to class virtually, for example, and how that affects going to work or all these things. So has there been much thought put into what that would look like? And also, second question, though you mentioned that people often don't consciously think about how it's that it is virtual, and that's actually the exception rather than the typical case. What about, has there been studies done when trust is broken, for example? Let's say that all of a sudden someone became very conscious that the gaze is not genuine.
Yeah.
Has there been studies done into the effect of that when someone becomes conscious of it and remembers that?
So let me start with the second one, which is when when you're doing these transformations and they're consciously detected, they backfire. And we know this because in every study there's a subset of subjects that actually detect it, and we've actually done some where we've told them in advance. And thus far in our studies, when people know what's going on, they really resent the fact that they view it as deception, basically. So this resonates with the earlier point, which is that the people are going to get savvy and the algorithms are going to get more more subtle, and you're going to see a lot more of that. When I give a lecture on this, I talk about the transformations people do face to face. For example, wearing makeup or jackets that hide your gut, or there's a lot of things we do in this arena face to face. It's just you can do a lot more digitally. And so how these comfort levels of deception, what becomes acceptable online is going to be a very fun thing to watch. On your first one, I give a whole talk, so a lot of my research that's not education-based is about trying to help people understand and defend the environment. And a lot of the research that I do tries to get people to conserve resources. One of the great ways, the obvious kind of low-hanging fruits here is that, look, you should travel when you want to, right? But the fact that I have to commute to work 10 times a week, that's silly from my perspective. And so from an environmental standpoint, I view it's a really wonderful thing. If I can I flew to South Africa, Johannesburg, a month ago to give a talk about the future of virtual reality to a bunch of decision makers from across Africa. And I just ruined my carbon footprint for the year by doing that. And the talk was 40 minutes. And I agree that a videotape is probably not enough, but when we can make VR make an online interaction feel like this, it's going to be transformational in my mind in a good way. Now, it's above my pay grade to really understand how this is going to affect society and the economy, right? And which industries lose and which industries win. These are big questions that, the wonderful part of my job right now is that this stuff is coming everywhere. And the things I've been speaking about and studying for 20 years now matter to the world. The problem is it's moving so fast. It's moving so fast that understanding the nature of this and the changes it's going to make it's hard to take a step back. I mean, this device right here, the Kinect, and I talk to the folks at Microsoft all the time. I think they're great people. I don't think they're doing anything bad. But when you buy this, and there's 75 million of these in the country, it's always plugged into the wall. The instructions say, please leave this plugged into the internet so that you can get updates for your Xbox, which this feeds into. So in living rooms all across the country, you've got a device. This thing, in addition to having this depth camera, it's got a video camera and a microphone. Right? So there's 75 million homes, I don't know what percentage of them have it plugged into the internet, that are basically not only beaming your gestures, but videotapes and sounds of you. Microsoft is not recording it, they're not accessing it, but it's kind of a strange idea that the fact that these things that people think are just a video game controller can broadcast your living room to the world. So it's moving quickly.
Thanks for the talk. I'm Sabrina, MBA student. So I have two questions. The first one is, if you can make a prediction, how far do you think we are away from mass adoption? And what do you think are the main drivers for that? Is it the companies for commercial use, or is the government for education purpose, or is something else, somebody else?
Okay.
And what do you think are the main forces that are against it? Is it parents that have worry about antisocial of their children, or is it schools, teachers, that kind of thing? So this is the first question. The second question.
Let me answer that first, because there was a lot there. It's certainly not the government that's pushing this. I just had I have a lot of government folk come through, and this is by far this is not on their radar. This is not on their radar. So I do not believe the government is pushing this. And when I go to DC, they haven't really heard much about this. And it's probably a generalization. But why now? I could bore you with some details of computer graphics or about kind of a genius named Mark Bolas that revolutionized the way that we can solve a problem about curvature of lenses and distortion. That had a lot to do with it. The fact that social media has become so popular. Kids today between the ages of 8 and 18 in the United States, they consume media for 8 hours a day. And the fact they can reach their friends is one of the big drivers of that. So we know that people love virtual others, and the hardware has just caught up. Yeah.
The second question is, you mentioned the creation of a beta, which can mimic you and do whatever thing, even though you are not actually doing that.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, does that mean in future, every video, like education video, can look like someone's there actually teaching you, and that means every child could have his own personalized teacher, personalized curriculum?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we've done research where in teaching health, you see your doppelganger looks just like you, and you see your doppelganger losing weight as a function of exercising and eating the right foods. And this kind of idealized personal self is really powerful to changing people's behavior. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi there. My name's Scott Traylor. I'm a former computer science teacher, just recently moved to the area from the East Coast. And I've also made digital learning products for most of my life.
Great.
As I look at the technology, one of the things that I know is that there's inherent latency in hardware and software, and that if you don't have refresh rates under like 30 milliseconds, that people get nauseous.
Yep.
And while that's improving and hardware is speeding up and there's all kinds of great new techniques for improving refresh,
Yeah.
how long can somebody actually keep a headset on?
Sure.
We have this vision of like, well, someone sit through a 2-hour lecture or a 2-hour immersive experience, and I question whether their body can take that.
So I could talk about this for about 4 or 5 hours. So first of all, latency and refresh rates, I think we're at a point now where it's pretty comfortable. So in my lab, we never run less than 75 hertz in each eye, and the latency of the entire system from your body movement to display is about 30 milliseconds, okay? When Zuckerberg bought Oculus, they just put a ton of resources into reducing latency. And so have you used the DK2, the one we have out there? Okay. One thing I think that they're being really smart about is reducing latency. But we're doing a study right now. It's called Immersion at Scale. So sometimes we put on our psychophysics hats and we do some research that's not as fun to talk about, but it's kind of the bread and butter research. And so what we're doing is we've got suitcase VR systems we're going out to the world to collect a large amount of data, say thousands of people. We're just starting to do this because I can have a good system that runs off a suitcase, and I can do things like go from 75 hertz to 60 hertz. I can go from mono to stereo. I can go from wide to small field of view. And what we're doing for the first time ever, there's been studies like this before, but they've all had to been small in the lab. Because we can get about 1,000 people, we can look at the subtle interactions among these features, right? So it could be that mono stereo matters more with a high field of view than a low field of view, but it really that only matters to people between the age of 10 and 30. And so what we're doing is getting a massive, massive data set to really understand these features of technological immersion and how they do psychological presence. But I do urge you and anyone in this room, we give public tours of the lab. You can sign up online. And if you haven't used VR in a while, one area that I think you'll be very impressed in is how well the field has solved some of those problems. Now, but the bigger question that you're asking is how long can you wear this thing? I have never, in good conscience, ever had any of our subjects wear it for more than about 20 minutes without a break, and never for an hour total. Now I'm trying to be very careful because I'm a scientist trying not to hurt people. Now that the Oculus is out, there's people that are spending a lot of time in there. But there's one problem a head-mount display will never solve, which is the accommodation divergence problem, right? So in VR, when you're wearing a helmet, your eyes are focused on this device that's 5 centimeters in front of your nose, but you're seeing things as if they were 30 meters back. And how long, and that alone gets some people dizzy in the first 5 minutes. There's how I just got an email from a creative film director who is going to wear the Rift for 28 days. And I forgot the name of his project. It's something that's a take on the movie 28 Days Later. And he's going to receive the perceptual input of someone else for all day, every day for 28 days. And I immediately, because he asked me to give him a blurb or something, and I just said, the first thing you need to do is hire an optometrist. That's what you need to do first. So.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Kim, and I'm with the Open Learning Initiative. My question is, I think it's very interesting the part about if avatar starts to look like you do better. I'm curious, have you done anything with like diversity training or tolerance? Because that would seem like if you continue to look like yourself and everybody looks like you, that might go down one path where it'd be interesting to see what it'd be like to try and flip it on the other side.
When I first arrived at Stanford, this was one of my goals, to build a virtual mirror and have you see yourself as someone else. And so the first study we did in this, and we've done dozens. I love this topic. It's really near and dear to my heart. The first one we did is we had 20-somethings who tend to be very ageist. Okay, they've got stereotypes about the elderly, go in front of a mirror and see themselves transformed so that they move around in the mirror so that they achieve what the neuroscientists call body transfer. Really feels like it's you. And then we have them become older. And then they turn around and there's another person networked in VR with them, and that person discriminates against them. So they experience firsthand discrimination while in the body of the outgroup. And it's funny, your timing is fortuitous because we are very close to getting a grant from a foundation that's going to allow us to build empathy training simulations to go to inner cities to help kids from communities of conflict who may have a harder time learning some of these empathy skills, and really going out in the world and building educational modules to teach empathy using a lot of the things that I've been talking about. So that's an area that we care about a lot and have done some work in. But thanks. Thanks.